Chapter 19 of The Italian.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marty Chris. The Italian by Anne Radcliffe.
Chapter 19.
And yet I fear you, for you are fatal then, when your eyes roll so. Alas, why gnaw you so your nether lip? Some bloody passion shakes your very frame. These are portents, but yet I hope they do not point on me. Shakespeare. Elena was awakened from profound sleep by a loud noise at the door of her chamber when, starting from her mattress, she looked around her with surprise and dismay as imperfect recollections or the past began to gather on her mind. She distinguished the undrawing of iron bars, and then the countenance of Spalatro at her door, before she had a clear remembrance of her situation, that she was a prisoner in a house on a lonely shore, and that this man was her jailer. Such sickness of the heart returned with these convictions, such saintness and terror, that, unable to support her trembling frame, she sunk again upon the mattress without demanding the reason of this abrupt intrusion. "I have brought you some breakfast," said Spalatro, "if you are awake to take it, but you seem to be asleep yet. Surely you have had sleep sufficient for one night. You went to rest soon enough." Elena made no reply, but, deeply affected with a sense of her situation, looked with beseeching eyes at the man, who advanced holding forth an oaten cake and a basin of milk. "Where shall I set them?" said he. "You must needs be glad of them, since you had no supper." Elena thanked him, and desired he would place them on the floor, for there was neither table nor chair in the room. As he did this, she was struck with the expression of his countenance, which exhibited a strange mixture of archness and malignity. He seemed congratulating himself upon his ingenuity, and anticipating some occasion of triumph. And she was so much interested that her observation never quitted him while he remained in the room. As his eyes accidentally met hers, he turned them away with the abruptness of a person who is conscious of evil intentions, and fears lest they should be detected, nor once looked up till he hastily left the chamber, when she heard the door secured as formerly. The impression which his look had left on her mind so wholly engaged her in conjecture, that a considerable time elapsed before she remembered that he had brought the refreshment she so much required. But, as she now listed it to her lips, a horrible suspicion arrested her hand. It was not, however, before she had swallowed a small quantity of the milk. The look of Spalatro, which occasioned her surprise, had accompanied the setting down of the breakfast, and it occurred to her that poison was infused in this liquid. She was thus compelled to refuse the sustenance which was become necessary to her, for she feared to taste even the oaten cake, since Spalatro had offered it. But the little milk she had unwarily taken was so very small that she had no apprehension concerning it. The day, however, was passed in terror and almost in despondency. She could neither doubt the purpose for which she had been brought hither, nor discover any possibility of escaping from her persecutors. Yet that propensity to hope which buoys up the human heart even in the severest hours of trial sustained, in some degree, her fainting spirits. During these miserable hours of solitude and suspense, the only alleviation to her suffering arose from a belief that Vivaldi was safe, at least from danger, though not from grief. But she now understood too much of the dexterous contrivances of the Marchesa, his mother, to think it was practicable for him to escape from her designs, and again restore her to liberty. All day Elena either leaned against the bars of the window, lost in reverie, while her unconscious eyes were fixed upon the ocean, whose murmurs she no longer heard, or she listened for some sound from within the house that might assist her conjectures as to the number of persons below, or what might be passing there. The house, however, was profoundly still, except when now and then a footstep sauntered along a distant passage, or a door was heard to close, but not the hum of a single voice arose from the lower rooms, nor any symptom of there being more than one person beside herself in the dwelling. Though she had not heard her former guards depart, it appeared certain that they were gone, and that she was left alone in this place with Spalatro. What could be the purport of such a proceeding? Elena could not imagine. If her death was designed, it seemed strange that one person only should be left to the hazard of the deed, when three must have rendered the completion of it certain. But this surprise vanished when her suspicion of poison returned, for it was probable that these men had believed their scheme to be already nearly accomplished, and had abandoned her to die alone in a chamber from whence escape was impracticable, leaving Spalatro to dispose of her remains. All the incongruities she had separately observed in their conduct seemed now to harmonize and unite in one plan, and her death designed by poison, and that poison to be conveyed in the disguise of nourishment, appeared to have been the object of it. Whether it was that the strength of this conviction affected her fancy, or that the cause was real, Elena, remembering at this moment that she had tasted the milk, was seized with a universal shuddering, and thought she felt that the poison had been sufficiently potent to affect her, even in the inconsiderable quantity she might have taken. While she was thus agitated, she distinguished footsteps loitering near her door, and attentively listening, became convinced that some person was in the corridor. The steps moved softly, sometimes stopping for an instant, as if to allow time for listening, and soon after passed away. "It is Spalatro," said Elena. "He believes that I have taken the poison, and he comes to listen for my dying groans. Alas, he is only come somewhat too soon, perhaps." As this horrible supposition occurred, the shuddering returned with increased violence, and she sunk almost fainting on the mattress. But the fit was not of long continuance. When it gradually left her, and recollection revived, she perceived, however, the prudence of suffering Spalatro to suppose she had taken the beverage he brought her, since such belief would at least procure some delay of further schemes, and every delay afforded some possibility for hope to rest upon. Elena therefore poured through the bars of her window the milk which she believed Spalatro had designed should be fatal in its consequence. It was evening when she again fancied footsteps were lingering near her door, and the suspicion was confirmed when, on turning her eyes, she perceived a shade on the floor, underneath it as if some person stationed without. Presently the shadow glided away, and at the same time she distinguished departing steps treading cautiously. "It is he," said Elena. "He still listens for my moans." This further confirmation of his designs affected her nearly as much as the first. When anxiously turning her look towards the corridor, the shadow again appeared beneath the door, but she heard no step. Elena now watched it with intense solicitude and expectation, fearing every instant that Spalatro would conclude her doubts by entering the room. "And oh, when he discovers that I live," thought she, "what may I not expect during the first moments of his disappointment? What less than immediate death?" The shadow, after remaining a few minutes stationary, moved a little, and then glided away as before. But it quickly returned, and a low sound followed, as of some person endeavoring to unfasten bolts without noise. Elena heard one bar gently withdrawn, and then another. She observed the door begin to move, and then to give way, till it gradually unclosed, and the face of Spalatro presented itself from behind it. Without immediately entering, he threw a glance round the chamber, as if he wished to ascertain some circumstance before he ventured further. His look was more than usually haggard as it rested upon Elena, who apparently reposed on her mattress. Having gazed at her for an instant, he ventured towards the bed with quick and unequal steps. His countenance expressed at once impatience, alarm, and the consciousness of guilt. When he was within a few paces, Elena raised herself, and he started back as if a sudden spectre had crossed him. The more than usual wildness and wanness of his looks, and the whole of his conduct, seemed to confirm all her former terrors, and when he roughly asked her how she did, Elena had not sufficient presence of mind to answer that she was ill. For some moments he regarded her with an earnest and sullen attention, and then a sly glance of scrutiny, which he threw round the chamber, told her that he was inquiring whether she had taken the poison. On perceiving that the basin was empty, he lifted it from the floor, and Elena fancied a gleam of satisfaction passed over his visage. "You have had no dinner," said he. "I forgot you, but supper will be soon ready, and you may walk up the beach till then, if you will." Elena was extremely surprised and perplexed by this offer of a seeming indulgence, knew not whether to accept or reject it. She suspected that some treachery lurked within it. The invitation appeared to be only a stratagem to lure her to destruction, and she determined to decline accepting it, when again she considered that to accomplish this it was not necessary to withdraw her from the chamber, where she was already sufficiently in the power of her persecutors. Her situation could not be more desperate than it was at present, and almost any change might make it less so. As she descended from the corridor and passed through the lower part of the house, no person appeared but her conductor, and she ventured to inquire whether the men who had brought her hither were departed. Spalato did not return an answer, but led the way in silence to the court, and having passed the gates, he pointed toward the west, and said she might walk that way. Elena bent her course towards the many-sounding waves, followed at a short distance by Spalato, and, wrapped in thought, pursued the windings of the shore, scarcely noticing the objects around her, till on passing the foot of a rock she lifted her eyes to the scene that unfolded beyond, and observed some huts scattered at a considerable distance, apparently the residence of fishermen. She could just distinguish the dark sails of some skiffs, turning the cliffs and entering the little bay, where the hamlet margined the beach, but though she saw the sails lowered as the boats approached the shore, they were too far off to allow the figures of the men to appear. To Elena, who had believed that no human habitation except her prison interrupted the vast solitudes of these forests and shores, the view of the huts, remote as they were, imparted a feeble hope, and even somewhat of joy. She looked back to observe whether Spalato was near. He was already within a few paces, and casting a wistful glance forward to the remote cottages, her heart sunk again. It was a lowering evening, and the sea was dark and swelling. The screams of the sea-birds, too, as they wheeled among the clouds and sought their high nests in the rocks, seemed to indicate an approaching storm. Elena was not so wholly engaged by selfish sufferings, but that she could sympathize with those of others, and she rejoiced that the fishermen whose boats she had observed had escaped the threatening tempest, and were safely sheltered in their little homes, where, as they heard the loud waves break along the coast, they could look with keener pleasure upon the social circle and the warm comforts around them. From such considerations, however, she returned again to a sense of her own forlorn and friendless situation. "Alas," said she, "I have no longer a home, a circle to smile welcomes upon me. I have no longer even one friend to support, to rescue me. I, a miserable wanderer on a distant shore, tracked perhaps by the footsteps of the assassin, who at this instant eyes his victim with silent watchfulness, and awaits the moment of opportunity to sacrifice her." Elena shuddered as she said this, and turned again to observe whether Spalato was near. He was not within view, and while she wondered and congratulated herself on a possibility of escaping, she perceived a monk walking silently beneath the dark rocks that overbrowed the beach. His black garments were folded around him, his face was inclined towards the ground, and he had the air of a man in deep meditation. "His no doubt are worthy musings," said Helena as she observed him, with mingled hope and surprise. "I may address myself without fear to one of his order. It is probably as much as his wish as it is his duty to succor the unfortunate. Who could have hoped to find on this sequestered shore so sacred a protector? His convent cannot be far off." He approached, his face still bent towards the ground, and Helena advanced slowly and with trembling steps to meet him. As he drew near, he viewed her askance without lifting his head, but she perceived his large eyes looking from under the shade of his cowl and the upper part of his peculiar countenances. Her confidence in his protection began to fail, and she faltered, unable to speak, and scarcely daring to meet his eyes. The monk stalked past her in silence, the lower part of his visage still muffled in his drapery, and as he passed her looked neither with curiosity nor surprise. Helena paused, and determined, when he should be at some distance, to endeavor to make her way to the hamlet and throw herself upon the humanity of its inhabitants, rather than solicit the pity of this forbidding stranger. But in the next moment she heard a step behind her, and on turning saw the monk again approaching. He stalked by as before, surveying her, however, with a sly and scrutinizing glance from the corners of his eyes. His air and countenance were equally repulsive, and still Helena could not summon courage enough to attempt engaging his compassion, but shrunk from an enemy. There was something also terrific in the silent stalk of so gigantic a form. It announced both power and treachery. He passed slowly on to some distance, and disappeared among the rocks. Helena turned once more with an intention of hastening towards the distant hamlet before Spalatro should observe her, whose strange absence she had scarcely time to wonder at. But she had not proceeded far when suddenly she perceived the monk again at her shoulder. She started and almost shrieked, while he regarded her with more attention than before. He paused a moment, and seemed to hesitate, after which he again passed on in silence. The distress of Helena increased. He was gone the way she had designed to run, and she feared almost equally to follow him and to return to her prison. Presently he turned and passed her again, and Helena hastened forward. But when, fearful of being pursued, she again looked back, she observed him conversing with Spalatro. They appeared to be in consultation, while they slowly advanced, till, probably observing her rapid progress, Spalatro called on her to stop, in a voice that echoed among all the rocks. It was a voice which would not be disobeyed. She looked hopelessly at the still distant cottages, and slackened her stops. Presently the monk again passed before her, and Spalatro had again disappeared. The frown with which the former now regarded Helena was so terrific that she shrunk trembling back, though she knew him not for her persecutor, since she had never consciously seen Schedoni. He was agitated, and his look became darker. "Whither go you?" said he, in a voice that was stifled by emotion. "Who is it, father, that asks the question?" said Helena, endeavoring to appear composed. "Whither go you, and who are you?" repeated the monk, more sternly. "I am an unhappy orphan," replied Helena, sighing deeply. "If you are, as your habit denotes, a friend to the charities, you will regard me with compassion." Schedoni was silent, and then said, "Who and what is it that you fear?" "I fear even for my life," replied Helena with hesitation. She observed a darker shade pass over his countenance. "For your life?" said he, with apparent surprise. "Who is there that would think it worth the taking?" Helena was struck with these words. "Poor insect!" added Skidoni. Who would crush thee? Elena made no reply. She remained with her eyes fixed in amazement upon his face. There was something in his manner of pronouncing this, yet more extraordinary than in the words themselves. Alarmed by his manner, and awed by the increasing gloom and swelling surge that broke in the thunder on the beach, she had at length turned away and again walked towards the hamlet, which was yet very remote. He soon overtook her, when rudely seizing her arm and gazing earnestly on her face. "Who is it that you fear?" said he. "Say, who?" "That is more than I dare to say," replied Elena, scarcely able to sustain herself. "Ha! Is it even so?" said the monk, with increasing emotion. His visage now became so terrible that Elena struggled to liberate her arm, and supplicated that he would not detain her. He was silent, and still gazed upon her, but his eyes, when she had ceased to struggle, assumed the fixed and vacant glare of a man whose thoughts have retired within themselves, and who is no longer conscious to surrounding objects. "I beseech you to release me," repeated Elena. "It is late, and I am far from home." "That is true," muttered Skidoni, still grasping her arm, and seeming to reply to his own thoughts rather than to her words. "That is very true." "The evening is closing fast," continued Elena, "and I shall be overtaken by the storm." Skidoni still mused, and then muttered, "The storm, say you? Why, aye, let it come." As he spoke, he suffered her arm to drop, but still held it, and walked slowly towards the house. Elena, thus compelled to accompany him, and yet more alarmed both by his looks, his incoherent answers, and his approach to her prison, renewed her supplications and her efforts for liberty, in a voice of piercing distress, adding, "I am far from home, father. Night is coming on. See how the rocks darken. I am far from home, and shall be waited for." "That is false," said Skidoni with emphasis, "and you know it to be so." "Alas, I do," replied Elena, with mingled shame and grief. "I have no friends to wait for me." "What do those deserve who deliberately utter falsehoods?" continued the monk, "who deceive and slatter young men to their destruction?" "Father!" exclaimed the astonished Elena. "Who disturb the peace of families, who trepan with wanton arts the heirs of noble houses, who, ha! What do such deserve?" Overcome with astonishment and terror, Elena remained silent. She now understood that Skidoni, so far from being likely to prove a protector, was an agent of her worst, and, as she had believed, her only enemy, and an apprehension of the immediate and terrible vengeance which such an agent seemed willing to accomplish, subdued her senses. She tottered and sunk upon the beach. The weight which strained the arm Skidoni held called his attention to her situation. As he gazed upon her helpless and faded form, he became agitated. He quitted it and traversed the beach in short turns, and with hasty steps came back again and bent over it. His heart seemed sensible to some touch of pity. At one moment he stepped towards the sea, and taking water in the hollows of his hands, threw it upon her face. At another, seeming to regret that he had done so, he would stamp with sudden fury upon the shore, and walk abruptly to a distance. The conflict between his design and his conscience was strong, or perhaps it was only between his passions. He who had hitherto been insensible to every tender feeling, who, governed by ambition and resentment, had contributed by his artful instigations to fix the baleful resolution of the Marchesa di Vivaldi, and who was come to execute her purpose. Even he could not now look upon the innocent, the wretched Helena without yielding to the momentary weakness, as he termed it, of compassion. While he was yet unable to baffle the new emotion by evil passions, he despised that which conquered him. "And shall the weakness of a girl," said he, "subdue the resolution of a man? Shall the view of her transient sufferings unnerve my firm heart, and compel me to renounce the lofty plans I have so ardently, so laboriously imagined, at the very instant when they are changing into realities? Am I awake? Is one spark of the fire which has so long smoldered within my bosom and consumed my peace alive? Or am I tame and abject as my fortunes? Ha! As my fortunes! Shall the spirit of my family yield for ever to circumstances? The question rouses it, and I feel its energy revive within me." He stalked with hasty steps towards Helena, as if he feared to trust his resolution with a second pause. He had a dagger concealed beneath his monk's habit, as he had also an assassin's heart shrouded by his garments. He had a dagger, but he hesitated to use it. The blood which it might spill would be observed by the peasants of the neighboring hamlet, and might lead to a discovery. It would be safer, he considered, and easier to lay Helena, senseless as she was, in the waves. Their coldness would recall her to life only at the moment before they would suffocate her. As he stooped to lift her, his resolution faltered again on beholding her innocent face, and in that moment she moved. He started back, as if she could have known his purpose, and knowing it, could have avenged herself. The water which he had thrown upon her face had gradually revived her. She unclosed her eyes, and on perceiving him shrieked and attempted to rise. His resolution was subdued, so tremblingly fearful is guilt in the moment when it would execute its atrocities. Overcome with apprehensions, yet agitated with shame and indignation against himself for being so, he gazed at her for an instant in silence, and then abruptly turned away his eyes and left her. Helena listened to his departing steps, and raising herself, observed him retiring among the rocks that led towards the house. Astonished at his conduct, and surprised to find that she was alone, Helena renewed all her efforts to sustain herself till she should reach the hamlet so long the object of her hopes. But she had proceeded only a few paces when Spalatro again appeared swiftly approaching. Her utmost exertion availed her nothing. Her feeble steps were soon overtaken, and Helena perceived herself again his prisoner. The look with which she resigned herself awakened no pity in Spalatro, who uttered some taunting jest upon the swiftness of her flight, as he led her back to her prison, and proceeded in sullen watchfulness. Once again, then, she entered the gloomy walls of that fatal mansion, never more, she now believed, to quit them with life, a belief which was strengthened when she remembered that the monk, on leaving her, had taken the way hither. For though she knew not how to account for his late forbearance, she could not suppose that he would long be merciful. He appeared no more, however, as she passed into her chamber, where Spalatro left her again to solitude and terror, and she heard that fateful door again barred upon her. When his retreating steps had ceased to sound, a stillness as of the grave prevailed in the house, like the dead calm which sometimes precedes the horrors of a tempest. End of
Chapter 19.
Reading by Marty Chris.
Chapter 20 of The Italian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Italian by Anne Radcliffe. Chapter 20, read by Gary Day. I am settled and bend up each corporal agent to this terrible seat. Shakespeare. Skidoni had returned from the beach to the house in a state of perturbation that defied the control of even his own stern will. On the way thither he met Spalatro, whom, as he dispatched him to Helena, he strictly commanded not to approach his chamber till he should be summoned. Having reached his apartment, he secured the door, though not any person except himself was in the house, nor anyone expected, but those who he knew would not dare to intrude upon him. Had it been possible, he would have shut out all consciousness of himself also. How willingly would he have done so! He threw himself into a chair, and remained for a considerable time motionless and lost in thought. Yet the emotions of his mind were violent and contradictory. At the very instant when his heart reproached him with the crime he had meditated, he regretted the ambitious views he must relinquish if he failed to perpetrate it, and regarded himself with some degree of contempt for having hitherto hesitated on the subject. He considered the character of his own mind with astonishment, for circumstances had drawn forth traits of which till now he had no suspicion. He knew not by what doctrine to explain the inconsistencies, the contradictions he experienced, and, perhaps, it was not one of the least that in these moments of direful and conflicting passions his reason could still look down upon their operations, and lead him to a cool though brief examination of his own nature. But the subtlety of self-love still eluded his inquiries, and he did not detect that pride was even at this instant of self-examination, and of critical import, the master-spring of his mind. In the earlier dawn of his character, this passion had displayed its predominancy whenever occasion permitted, and its influence had led to some of the chief events of his life. The Count di Marinella, for such had formerly been the title of the confessor, was the younger son of an ancient family who resided in the Duchy of Milan, and near the feet of the Tyrolean Alps, on such estates of their ancestors as the Italian wars of a former century had left them. The portion which he had received at the death of his father was not large, and Skidoni was not of a disposition to improve his patrimony by slow diligence, or to submit to the restraint and humiliation which his narrow finances would have imposed. He disdained to acknowledge an inferiority of fortune to those with whom he considered himself equal in rank, and as he was destitute of generous feeling and of sound judgment, he had not that loftiness of soul which is ambitious of true grandeur. On the contrary, he was satisfied with an ostentatious display of pleasures and of power, and thoughtless of the consequence of dissipation, was contented with the pleasures of the moment, till his exhausted resources compelled him to pause and to reflect. He perceived, too late for his advantage, that it was necessary for him to dispose of part of his estate, and to confine himself to the income of the remainder. Incapable of submitting with grace to the reduction which his folly had rendered expedient, he endeavoured to obtain by cunning the luxuries that his prudence had failed to keep, and which neither his genius nor his integrity could command. He withdrew, however, from the eyes of his neighbours, unwilling to submit his altered circumstances to their observation. Concerning several years of his life, from this period nothing was generally known, and when he was next discovered, it was in the Spirito Santo convent at Naples, in the habit of a monk, and under the assumed name of Skidoni. His air and countenance were as much altered as his way of life. His looks had become gloomy and severe, and the pride which had mingled with the gaiety of their former expression occasionally discovered itself under the disguise of humility, but more frequently in the austerity of silence, and in the barbarity of penance. The person who discovered Schedoni would not have recollected him, had not his remarkable eyes first fixed his attention, and then revived remembrance. As he examined his features, he traced the faint resemblance of what Marinella had been, to whom he had made himself known. The confessor affected to have forgotten his former acquaintance, and assured him that he was mistaken respecting himself, till the stranger so closely urged some circumstances that the former was no longer permitted to dissemble. He retired in some emotion with the stranger, and, whatever might be the subject of their conference, he drew from him, before he quitted the convent, a tremendous vow to keep secret from the brotherhood his knowledge of Schedoni's family, and never to reveal without those walls that he had seen him. These requests he had urged in a manner that at once surprised and awed the stranger, and which, at the same time that it manifested the weight of Schedoni's fears, bade the former tremble for the consequence of disobedience, and he shuddered even while he promised to obey. Of the first part of the promise he was probably strictly observant. Whether he was equally so of the second does not appear. It is certain that after this period he was never more seen or heard of at Naples. Schedoni, ever ambitious of distinction, adapted his manners to the views and prejudices of the society with whom he resided, and became one of the most exact observers of their outward forms, and almost a prodigy of self-denial and severe discipline. He was pointed out by the fathers of the convent to the juniors as a great example, who was, however, rather to be looked up to with reverential admiration than with an hope of emulating his sublime virtues. But with such panegyrics their friendship for Schedoni concluded. They found it convenient to applaud the austerities which they declined to practise. It procured them a character for sanctity, and saved them the necessity of earning it by mortifications of their own. But they both feared and hated Schedoni for his pride and his gloomy austerities, too much to gratify his ambition by anything further than empty praise. He had been several years in the society without obtaining any considerable advancement, and with the mortification of seeing persons who had never emulated his severity raised to high offices in the church, somewhat too late he discovered that he was not to expect any substantial favour from the brotherhood, and then it was that his restless and disappointed spirit first sought preferment by other avenues. He had been some years confessor to the Marchesa di Vivaldi, when the conduct of her son awakened his hopes, by showing him that he might render himself not only useful but necessary to her by his counsels. It was his custom to study the characters of those around him, with a view of adapting them to his purposes, and, having ascertained that of the Marchesa, these hopes were encouraged. He perceived that her passions were strong, her judgment weak, and he understood that, if circumstances should ever enable him to be serviceable in promoting the end at which any one of those passions might aim, his fortune would be established. At length he so completely insinuated himself into her confidence, and became so necessary to her views, that he could demand his own terms; and this he had not failed to do, though with all the affected delicacy and finesse that his situation seemed to require. An office of high dignity in the church, which had long vainly excited his ambition, was promised him by the Marchesa, who had sufficient influence to obtain it. Her condition was that of his preserving the honour of her family, as she delicately termed it, which she was careful to make him understand could be secured only by the death of Elena. He acknowledged with the Marchesa that the death of this fascinating young woman was the only means of preserving that honour, since, if she lived, they had every evil to expect from the attachment and character of Vivaldi, who would discover and extricate her from any place of confinement, however obscure or difficult to access, to which she might be conveyed. How long and how arduously the confessor had aimed to oblige the Marchesa has already appeared. The last scene was now arrived, and he was on the eve of committing that atrocious act which was to secure the pride of her house, and to satisfy at once his ambition and his desire of vengeance, when an emotion new and surprising to him had arrested his arm and compelled his resolution to falter. But this emotion was transient. It disappeared almost with the object that had awakened it, and now, in the silence and retirement of his chamber, he had leisure to recollect his thoughts, to review his schemes, to reanimate his resolution, and to wonder again at the pity which had almost won him from his purpose. The ruling passion of his nature once more resumed its authority, and he determined to earn the honour which the Marchesa had in store for him. After some cool and more of tumultuous consideration, he resolved that Elena should be assassinated that night, while she slept, and afterwards conveyed through a passage of the house communicating with the sea, into which the body might be thrown and buried with her sad story beneath the waves. For his own sake, he would have avoided the danger of shedding blood, had this appeared easy; but he had too much reason to know she had suspicions of poison to trust to a second attempt by such means; and again his indignation rose against himself, since by yielding to a momentary compassion he had lost the opportunity afforded him of throwing her unresistingly into the surge. Spalatro, as has already been hinted, was a former confidant of the confessor, who knew too truly from experience that he could be trusted, and had therefore engaged him to assist on this occasion. To the hands of this man he consigned the fate of the unhappy Elena, himself recoiling from the horrible act he had willed, and intending by such a step to involve Spalatro more deeply in the guilt, and thus more effectually to secure his secret. The night was far advanced before Schedoni's final resolution was taken, when he summoned Spalatro to his chamber to instruct him in his office. He bolted the door by which the man had entered, forgetting that themselves were the only persons in the house, except the poor Elena, who, unsuspicious of what was conspiring, and her spirits worn out by the late scene, was sleeping peacefully on her mattress above. Schedoni moved softly from the door he had secured, and, beckoning Spalatro to approach, spoke in a low voice, as if he feared to be overheard. "Have you perceived any sound from her chamber lately?" said he. "Does she sleep, think you?" "No one has moved there for this hour past, at least," replied Spalatro. "I have been watching in the corridor till you called, and should have heard if she had stirred. The old floor shakes so with every step." "Then hear me, Spalatro," said the confessor. "I have tried and found thee faithful, or I should not trust thee in a business of confidence like this. Recollect all I said to thee in the morning, and be resolute and dexterous, as I have ever found thee." Spalatro listened in gloomy attention, and the monk proceeded. "It is late. Go therefore to her chamber. Be certain that she sleeps. Take this," he added, "and this," giving him a dagger and a large cloak. "You know how you are to use them." He paused, and fixed his penetrating eyes on Spalatro, who held up the dagger in silence, examined the blade, and continued to gaze upon it with a vacant stare, as if he was unconscious of what he did. "You know your business," repeated Schedoni authoritatively. "Dispatch. Time wears, and I must set off early." The man made no reply. "The morning dawns already," said the confessor, still more urgently. "Do you falter? Do you tremble? Do I not know you?" Spalatro put up the poignard in his bosom without speaking, threw the cloak over his arm, and moved with a loitering step towards the door. Dispatch, repeated the confessor. Why do you linger? I cannot say that I like this business, signor, said Spalatro surlily. I know not why I should always do the most and be paid the least. Sordid villain, exclaimed Schedoni. You are not satisfied, then? No more a villain than yourself, signor, retorted the man, throwing down the cloak. I only do your business, and 'tis you that are sordid, for you would take all the reward, and I would only have a poor man have his dues. Do the work yourself, or give me the greater profit. Peace, said Schedoni. Dare no more to insult me with the mention of reward. Do you imagine I have sold myself? 'Tis my will that she dies. This is sufficient. And for you, the price you have asked has been granted. It is too little, replied Spalatro. And besides, I do not like the work. What harm has she done me? Since when is it that you have taken upon you to moralise? Said the confessor. And how long are these cowardly scruples to last? This is not the first time you have been employed. What harm has others done to you? You forget that I know you. You forget the past. No, signor, I remember it too well. I wish I could forget. I remember it too well. I have never been at peace since. The bloody hand is always before me, and often of a night, when the sea roars and the storms shake the house, they have come, all gashed as I left them, and stood before my bed. I have got up and ran out upon the shore for safety. Peace, repeated the confessor. Where is this frenzy of fear to end? To what are these visions, painted in blood, to lead? I thought I was talking with a man, but I find I am speaking only to a baby, possessed with his nurse's dreams. Yet I understand you. You shall be satisfied. Schedoni, however, had for once misunderstood this man, when he could not believe it possible that he really was averse to execute what he had undertaken. Whether the innocence and beauty of Helena had softened his heart, or that his conscience did torture him for his past deeds, he persisted in refusing to murder her. His conscience or his pity was of a very peculiar kind, however, for though he refused to execute the deed himself, he consented to wait at the foot of the back staircase that communicated with Helena's chamber, while Schedoni accomplished it, and afterwards to assist in carrying the body to the shore. This is a compromise between conscience and guilt, worthy of a demon, muttered Schedoni, who appeared to be insensible that he had made the same compromise with himself not an hour before, and whose extreme reluctance at this moment to perpetrate with his own hand what he had willingly designed for another ought to have reminded him of that compromise. Spalatro, released from the immediate office of an executioner, endured silently the abusive yet half stifled indignation of the confessor, who also bade him remember that, though he now shrunk from the most active part of this transaction, he had not always been restrained in offices of the same nature. By equal compunction, and that not only his means of subsistence but his very life was at his mercy, Spalatro readily acknowledged that it was so, and Schedoni knew too well the truth of what he had urged to be restrained from his purpose by any apprehension of the consequence of a discovery from this ruffian. "Give me the dagger, then," said the confessor after a long pause. "Take up the cloak, and follow to the staircase. Let me see whether your valour will carry you thus far." Spalatro resigned the stiletto, and threw the cloak again over his arm. The confessor stepped to the door, and trying to open it, "It is fastened," said he in alarm. "Some person has got into the house. It is fastened." "That well may be, Senor," replied Spalatro calmly, "for I saw you bolt it yourself after I came into the room." "True," said Schedoni, recovering himself. "That is true." He opened it, and proceeded along the silent passages towards the private staircase, often pausing to listen, and then stepping more lightly. The terrific Schedoni, in this moment of meditative guilt, feared even the feeble Helena. At the foot of the staircase he again stopped to listen. "Do you hear anything?" said he in a whisper. "I hear only the sea," replied the man. "Hush! It is something more," said Schedoni. "That is the murmur of voices." They were silent. After a pause of some length, "It is perhaps the voice of the spectres I told you of, signor," said Spalatro with a sneer. "Give me the dagger," said Schedoni. Spalatro, instead of obeying, now grasped the arm of the confessor, who, looking at him for an explanation of this extraordinary action, was still more surprised to observe the paleness and horror of his countenance. His starting eyes seemed to follow some object along the passage, and Schedoni, who began to partake of his feelings, looked forward to discover what occasioned this dismay, but could not perceive anything that justified it. "What is it you fear?" said he at length. Spalatro's eyes were still moving in horror. "Did you see nothing?" said he, pointing. Schedoni looked again, but did not distinguish any object in the remote gloom of the passage, whither Spalatro's sight was now fixed. "Come, come," said he, ashamed of his own weakness, "this is not a moment for such fancies. Awake from this idle dream." Spalatro withdrew his eyes, but they retained all their wildness. "It was no dream," said he, in the voice of a man who is exhausted by pain, and begins to breathe somewhat more freely again. "I saw it as plainly as I now see you." "Dotard, what did you see?" inquired the confessor. "It came before my eyes in a moment, and showed itself distinctly and outspread." "What showed itself?" repeated Schedoni. "And then it beckoned, yes, it beckoned me, with that blood-stained finger, and glided away down the passage, still beckoning, till it was lost in the darkness." "This is a very frenzy," said Schedoni, excessively agitated. "Arouse yourself, and be a man." "Frenzy? Would it were, signor! I saw that dreadful hand. I see it now. It is there again. There!" Schedoni, shocked, embarrassed, and once more infected with the strange emotions of Spalatro, looked forward, expecting to discover some terrific object; but still nothing was visible to him, and he soon recovered himself sufficiently to endeavour to appease the fancy of this conscience-struck ruffian. But Spalatro was insensible to all he could urge, and the confessor, fearing that his voice, though weak and stifled, would awaken Helena, tried to withdraw him from the spot to the apartment they had quitted. "The wealth of San Loretto should not make me go that way, signor," replied he, shuddering. "That was the way it beckoned. It vanished that way." Every emotion now yielded with Schedoni to that of apprehension lest Helena, being awakened, should make his task more horrid by a struggle, and his embarrassment increased at each instant, for neither command, menace, or entreaty could prevail with Spalatro to retire, till the monk luckily remembered a door which opened beyond the staircase, and would conduct them by another way to the opposite side of the house. The man consented so to depart, when, Schedoni unlocking a suite of rooms, of which he had always kept the keys, they passed in silence through an extent of desolate chambers, till they reached the one which they had lately left. Here, relieved from apprehension respecting Helena, the confessor expostulated more freely with Spalatro, but neither argument nor menace could prevail, and the man persisted in refusing to return to the staircase, though protesting at the same time that he would not remain alone in any part of the house, till the wine with which the confessor abundantly supplied him began to overcome the terrors of his imagination. At length his courage was so much reanimated that he consented to resume his station, and await at the foot of the stairs the accomplishment of Schedoni's dreadful errand, with which agreement they returned thither by the way they had lately passed. The wine, with which Schedoni also had found it necessary to strengthen his own resolution, did not secure him from severe emotion when he found himself again near Helena, but he made a strenuous effort for self-subjection as he demanded the dagger of Spalatro. "You have it already, signor," replied the man. "True," said the monk. "Ascend softly, or our steps may awaken her." "You said I was to wait at the foot of the stairs, signor, while you—" "True, true, true," muttered the confessor, and had begun to ascend, when his attendant desired him to stop. "You are going in darkness, signor. You have forgotten the lamp. I have another here." Schedoni took it angrily without speaking, and was again ascending, when he hesitated, and once more paused. "The glare will disturb her," thought he. "It is better to go in darkness." Yet he considered that he could not strike with certainty without light to direct his hand, and he kept the lamp, but returned once more to charge Spalatro not to stir from the foot of the stairs till he called, and to ascend to the chamber upon the first signal. "I will obey, signor, if you, on your part, will promise not to give the signal till all is over." "I do promise," replied Schedoni. "No more." Again he ascended, nor stopped till he reached Helena's door, where he listened for a sound; but all was as silent as if death already reigned in the chamber. This door was, from long disuse, difficult to be opened. Formerly it would have yielded without sound, but now Schedoni was fearful of noise from every effort he made to move it. After some difficulty, however, it gave way, and he perceived by the stillness within the apartment that he had not disturbed Helena. He shaded the lamp with the door for a moment, while he threw an inquiring glance forward, and when he did venture further, held part of his dark drapery before the light, to prevent the rays from spreading through the room. As he approached the bed, her gentle breathings informed him that she still slept, and the next moment he was at her side. She lay in deep and peaceful slumber, and seemed to have thrown herself upon the mattress, after having been wearied by her griefs; for though sleep pressed heavily on her eyes, their lids were yet wet with tears. While Schedoni gazed for a moment upon her innocent countenance, a faint smile stole over it. He stepped back. "She smiles in her murderous face," said he, shuddering. "I must be speedy." He searched for the dagger, and it was some time before his trembling hand could disengage it from the folds of his garment. But having done so, he again drew near, and prepared to strike. Her dress perplexed him. It would interrupt the blow, and he stooped to examine whether he could turn her robe aside without waking her. As the light passed over her face, he perceived that the smile had vanished. The visions of her sleep were changed, for tears stole from beneath her eyelids, and her features suffered a slight convulsion. She spoke. Schedoni, apprehending that the light had disturbed her, suddenly drew back, and again irresolute, shaded the lamp, and concealed himself behind the curtain, while he listened. But her words were inward and indistinct, and convinced him that she still slumbered. His agitation and repugnance to strike increased with every moment of delay, and, as often as he prepared to plunge the poniard in her bosom, a shuddering horror restrained him. Astonished at his own feelings, and indignant at what he termed a dastardly weakness, he found it necessary to argue with himself, and his rapid thoughts said, "Do I not feel the necessity of this act? Does not what is dearer to me than existence, does not my consequence depend on the execution of it? Is she not also beloved by the young Vivaldi? Have I already forgotten the church of the Spirito Santo?" This consideration reanimated him. Vengeance nerved his arm, and drawing aside the lawn from her bosom, he once more raised to strike, when, after gazing for an instant, some new cause of horror seemed to seize all his frame, and he stood for some moments aghast and motionless like a statue. His respiration was short and laborious, chilly drops stood upon his forehead, and all his faculties of mind seemed suspended. When he recovered, he stooped to examine again the miniature which had occasioned this revolution, and which had lain concealed beneath the lawn that he withdrew. The terrible certainty was almost confirmed, and, forgetting in his patience to know the truth, the imprudence of suddenly discovering himself to Helena at this hour of the night, and with a dagger at his feet, he called loudly, "Awake! Awake! Say, what is your name? Speak quickly!" Helena, aroused by a man's voice, started from her mattress, when, perceiving Schedoni, and by the pale glare of the lamp his haggard countenance, she shrieked and sunk back on the pillow. She had not fainted, and believing that he came to murder her, she now exerted herself to plead for mercy. The energy of her feelings enabled her to rise and throw herself at his feet. "Be merciful, O Father, be merciful!" said she in a trembling voice. "Father," interrupted Schedoni with earnestness; and then, seeming to restrain himself, he added, with unaffected surprise, "Why are you thus terrified?" For he had lost, in new interests and emotions, all consciousness of evil intention, and of the singularity of his situation. "What do you fear?" he repeated. "Have pity, Holy Father!" exclaimed Helena in agony. "Why do you not say whose portrait that is?" demanded he, forgetting that he had not asked the question before. "Whose portrait?" repeated the confessor in a loud voice. "Whose portrait?" said Helena with quick surprise. "Ay, how came you by it? Be quick. Whose resemblance is it?" "Why should you wish to know?" said Helena. "Answer my question," repeated Schedoni with increasing sternness. "I cannot part with it, Holy Father," replied Helena, pressing it to her bosom. "You do not wish me to part with it? Is it impossible to make you answer my question?" said he in extreme perturbation, and turning away from her. "Has fear utterly confounded you?" Then, again stepping towards her and seizing her wrist, he repeated the demand in a tone of desperation. "Alas, he is dead, or I should not now want a protector," replied Helena, shrinking from his grasp and weeping. "You trifle," said Schedoni with a terrible look. "I once more demand an answer. Whose picture?" Helena lifted it, gazed upon it for a moment, and then, pressing it to her lips, said, "This was my father." "Your father?" he repeated in an inward voice. "Your father?" and, shuddering, turned away. Helena looked at him with surprise. "I never knew a father's care," she said, "nor till lately did I perceive the want of it. But now " "His name?" interrupted the confessor. "But now," continued Helena, "if you are not as a father to me, to whom can I look for protection?" "His name?" repeated Schedoni, with sterner emphasis. "It is sacred," replied Helena, "for he was unfortunate." "His name?" demanded the confessor furiously. "I have promised to conceal it, Father." "On your life, I charge you to tell it. Remember, on your life." Helena trembled, was silent, and with supplicating looks implored him to desist from inquiry; but he urged the question more irresistibly. "His name, then," said she, "was Marinella." Schedoni groaned and turned away; but in a few seconds, struggling to command the agitation that shattered his whole frame, he returned to Helena, and raised her from her heels, on which she had thrown herself to implore mercy. "The place of his residence?" said the monk. "It was far from hence," she replied. but he demanded an unequivocal answer, and she reluctantly gave one. Skedoni turned away as before, groaned heavily, and paced the chamber without speaking, while Helena in her turn inquired the motive of his questions and the occasion of his agitation. But he seemed not to notice anything she said, and, wholly given up to his feelings, was inflexibly silent, while he stalked with measured steps along the room, and his face, half hid by his cowl, was bent towards the ground. Helena's terror began to yield to astonishment, and this emotion increased when, Skedoni approaching her, she perceived tears swell in his eyes, which were fixed on hers, and his countenance soften from the wild disorder that had marked it. Still he could not speak. At length he yielded to the fullness of his heart, and Skedoni, the stern Skedoni, wept and sighed. He seated himself on the mattress beside Helena, took her hand, which she, affrighted, attempted to withdraw, and when he could command his voice, said, "Unhappy child, behold your more unhappy father." As he concluded, his voice was overcome by groans, and he drew the cowl entirely over his face. "My father!" exclaimed the astonished and doubting Helena. "My father!" And fixing her eyes upon him, he gave no reply; but when, a moment after, he lifted his head, "Why do you reproach me with those looks?" said the conscious Skedoni. "Reproach you! Reproach my father!" repeated Helena, in accents softening into tenderness. "Why should I reproach my father?" "Why," exclaimed Skedoni, starting from his seat, "great God!" As he moved, he stumbled over the dagger at his foot. At that moment it might be said to strike into his heart. He pushed it hastily from sight. Helena had not observed it, but she observed his labouring breast, his distracted looks, and quick steps as he walked to and fro in the chamber; and she asked, with the most soothing accents of compassion and looks of anxious gentleness, what made him so unhappy, and tried to assuage his sufferings. They seemed to increase with every wish he expressed to dispel them. At one moment he would pause to gaze upon her, and in the next would quit her with a frenzied start. "Why do you look so piteously upon me, father?" Helena said. "Why are you so unhappy? Tell me, that I may comfort you." This appeal renewed all the violence of remorse and grief, and he pressed her to his bosom, and wetted her cheek with his tears. Helena wept to see him weep, till her doubts began to take alarm. Whatever might be the proofs that had convinced Skedoni of the relationship between them, he had not explained these to her; and however strong was the eloquence of nature which she witnessed, it was not sufficient to justify an entire confidence in the assertion he had made, or to allow her to permit his caresses without trembling. She shrunk and endeavoured to disengage herself, when, immediately understanding her, he said, "Can you doubt the cause of these emotions, these signs of paternal affection?" "Have I not reason to doubt?" replied Helena timidly, "since I never witnessed them before." He withdrew his arms, and, fixing his eyes earnestly on hers, regarded her for some moments in expressive silence. "Poor innocent!" said he at length. "You know not how much your words convey. It is true you have never known a father's tenderness till now." His countenance darkened while he spoke, and he rose again from his seat. Helena, meanwhile, astonished, terrified, and oppressed by a variety of emotions, had no power to demand his reasons for the belief that so much agitated him, or any explanation of his conduct; but she appealed to the portrait, and endeavoured, by tracing some resemblance between it and Skedoni, to decide her doubts. The countenance of each was as different in character as in years. The miniature displayed a young man, rather handsome, of a gay and smiling countenance, yet the smile expressed triumph rather than sweetness, and his whole air and features were distinguished by a consciousness of superiority that rose even to haughtiness. Schedoni, on the contrary, advanced in years, exhibited a severe physiognomy, furrowed by thought no less than by time, and darkened by the habitual indulgence of morose passions. He looked as if he had never smiled since the portrait was drawn, and it seemed as if the painter, prophetic of Schedoni's future disposition, had arrested and embodied that smile, to prove hereafter that cheerfulness had once played upon his features. Though the expression was so different between the countenance which Schedoni formerly owned and that he now wore, the same character of haughty pride was visible in both, and Helena did trace a resemblance in the bold outline of the features, but not sufficient to convince her, without further evidence, that each belonged to the same person, and that the confessor had ever been the young cavalier in the portrait. In the first tumult of her thoughts, she had not had leisure to dwell upon the singularity of Schedoni's visiting her at this deep hour of the night, or to urge any questions, except vague ones, concerning the truth of her relationship to him. But now that her mind was somewhat recollected, and that his looks were less terrific, she ventured to ask a fuller explanation of these circumstances, and his reasons for the late extraordinary assertion. "It is past midnight, father," said Helena. "You may judge then how anxious I am to learn what motive led you to my chamber at this lonely hour." Schedoni made no reply. "Did you come to warn me of danger?" she continued. "Had you discovered the cruel designs of Spalatro? Ah, when I supplicated for your compassion on the shore this evening, you little thought what perils surrounded me, or you would—" "You say true," interrupted he in a hurried manner. "But name the subject no more. Why will you persist in returning to it?" His words surprised Helena, who had not even alluded to the subject till now; but the returning wildness of his countenance made her fearful of dwelling upon the topic, even so far as to point out his error. Another deep pause succeeded, during which Schedoni continued to pace the room, sometimes stopping for an instant to fix his eyes on Helena, and regarding her with an earnestness that seemed to partake of frenzy, and then gloomily withdrawing his regards, and sighing heavily as he turned away to a distant part of the room. She, meanwhile, agitated with astonishment at his conduct, as well as at her own circumstances, and with the fear of offending him by further questions, endeavoured to summon courage to solicit the explanation which was so important to her tranquillity. At length she asked how she might venture to believe a circumstance so surprising as that of which he had just assured her, and to remind him that he had not yet disclosed his reason for admitting the belief. The confessor's feelings were eloquent in reply; and when at length they were sufficiently subdued to permit him to talk coherently, he mentioned some circumstances concerning Helena's family that proved him at least to have been intimately acquainted with it, and others which she believed were known only to Bianchi and herself, that removed every doubt of his identity. This, however, was a period of his life too big with remorse, horror, and the first pangs of parental affection, to allow him to converse long. Deep solitude was necessary for his soul. He wished to plunge where no eye might restrain his emotions, or observe the overflowing anguish of his heart. Having obtained sufficient proof to convince him that Helena was indeed his child, and assured her that she should be removed from this house on the following day, and be restored to her home, he abruptly left the chamber. As he descended the staircase, Spalatro stepped forward to meet him, with the cloak which had been designed to wrap the mangled form of Helena, when it should be carried to the shore. "Is it done?" said the ruffian, in a stifled voice. "I am ready;" and he spread forth the cloak, and began to ascend. "Hold, villain, hold!" said Skidoni, lifting up his head for the first time. "Dare to enter that chamber, and your life shall answer for it." "What!" exclaimed the man, shrinking back astonished. "Will not hers satisfy you?" He trembled for the consequence of what he had said, when he observed the changing countenance of the confessor. But Skidoni spoke not. The tumult in his breast was too great for utterance, and he pressed hastily forward. Spalatro followed. "Be pleased to tell me what I am to do," said he, again holding forth the cloak. "Avaunt!" exclaimed the other, turning fiercely upon him. "Leave me!" "How!" said the man, whose spirit was now aroused. "Has your courage failed too, signor? If so, I will prove myself no bastard, though you call me one. I'll do the business myself." "Villain! Fiend!" cried Skidoni, seizing the ruffian by his throat, with a grasp that seemed intended to annihilate him, when, recollecting that the fellow was only willing to obey the very instructions he had himself but lately delivered to him, other emotions succeeded to that of rage. He slowly liberated him, and in accents broken and softening from sternness, bade him retire to rest. "Tomorrow," he added, "I will speak further with you. As for this night, I have changed my purpose. Begone!" Spalatro was about to express the indignation which astonishment and fear had hitherto overcome, but his employer repeated his command in a voice of thunder, and closed the door of his apartment with violence, as he shut out a man whose presence was becoming hateful to him. He felt relieved by his absence, and began to breathe more freely, till, remembering that this accomplice had just boasted that he was no bastard, he dreaded lest by way of proving the assertion he should attempt to commit the crime from which he had lately shrunk. Terrified at the possibility, and even apprehending that it might already have become a reality, he rushed from the room, and found Spalatro in the passage leading to the private staircase. But whatever might have been his purpose, the situation and looks of the latter were sufficiently alarming. At the approach of Skidoni, he turned his sullen and malignant countenance towards him, without answering his call, or the demand as to his business there, and with slow steps obeyed the order of his master that he should withdraw to his room. Thither Skidoni followed, and, having locked him in for the night, he repaired to the apartment of Helena, which he secured from the possibility of intrusion. He then returned to his own, not to sleep, but to abandon himself to the agonies of remorse and horror. And yet he shuddered like a man who has just recoiled from the brink of a precipice, but who still measures the gulf with his eye. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21, Part 1 of The Italian. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Italian by Anne Radcliffe, Chapter 21, Part 1, read by Gary Day. But their way lies through the perplexed paths of this drear wood, the nodding horror of whose shady brows threaten the forlorn and wandering passenger. Milton. Helena, when Schedoni had left her, recollected all the particulars which he had thought proper to reveal concerning her family, and, comparing them with such circumstances as the late Bianchi had related on the same subject, she perceived nothing that was contradictory between the two accounts. But she knew not even yet enough of her own story to understand why Bianchi had been silent as to some particulars which had just been disclosed. From Bianchi she had always understood that her mother had married a nobleman of the Duchy of Milan and of the house of Marinella, that the marriage had been unfortunate, and that she herself, even before the death of the Countess, had been committed to the care of Bianchi, the only sister of that lady. Of this event, or of her mother, Helena had no remembrance, for the kindness of Bianchi had obliterated from her mind the loss and the griefs of her early infancy, and she recollected only the accident which had discovered to her in Bianchi's cabinet after the death of the latter the miniature and the name of her father. When she had inquired the reason of this injunction, Bianchi replied that the degraded fortune of her house rendered privacy desirable, and answered her further questions concerning her father by relating that he died while she was an infant. The picture which Helena had discovered, Bianchi had found among the trinkets of the departed countess, and designed to present it at some future period to Helena, when her discretion might be trusted with a knowledge of her family. This was the whole of what Signora Bianchi had judged it necessary to explain, though in her last hours it appeared that she wished to reveal more, but it was then too late. Though Helena perceived that many circumstances of the relations given by Schedoni and by Signora Bianchi coincided, and that none were contradictory, except that of his death, she could not yet subdue her amazement at this discovery, or even the doubts which occasionally recurred to her as to its truth. Schedoni, on the contrary, had not even appeared surprised when she assured him that she always understood her father had been dead many years, though when she asked if her mother too was living, both his distress and his assurances confirmed the relation made by Bianchi. When Helena's mind became more tranquil, she noticed again the singularity of Schedoni's visit to her apartment at so sacred an hour, and her thoughts glanced back involuntarily to the scene of the preceding evening on the seashore, and the image of her father appeared in each, in the terrific character of an agent of the Marchesa di Vivaldi. The suspicions, however, which she had formerly admitted respecting his designs, were now impatiently rejected, for she was less anxious to discover truth than to release herself from horrible suppositions, and she willingly believed that Schedoni, having misunderstood her character, had only designed to assist in removing her beyond the reach of Vivaldi. The ingenuity of Hope suggested also that, having just heard from her conductors or from Spalatro some circumstances of her story, he had been led to a suspicion of the relationship between them, and that in the first impatience of parental anxiety he had disregarded the hour and come, though at midnight, to her apartment to ascertain the truth. While she soothed herself with this explanation of a circumstance which had occasioned her considerable surprise, she perceived on the floor the point of a dagger peeping from beneath the curtains. Emotions almost too horrible to be sustained followed this discovery. She took the instrument and gazed upon it aghast and trembling, for a suspicion of the real motive of Schedoni's visit glanced upon her mind. But it was only for a moment. Such a supposition was too terrible to be willingly endured. She again believed that Spalatro alone had meditated her destruction, and she thanked the confessor her deliverer, instead of shrinking from him as an assassin. She now understood that Skidoni, having discovered the ruffian's design, had rushed into the chamber to save a stranger from his murderous poniard, and had unconsciously rescued his own daughter, when the portrait at her bosom informed him of the truth. With this conviction, Elena's eyes overflowed with gratitude, and her heart was hushed to peace. Skidoni, meanwhile, shut up in his chamber, was agitated by feelings of a very opposite nature. When their first excess was exhausted, and his mind was calm enough to reflect, the images that appeared on it struck him with solemn wonder. In pursuing Elena at the criminal instigation of the Marchesa di Vivaldi, it appeared that he had been persecuting his own child, and in thus consenting to conspire against the innocent, he had in the event been only punishing the guilty, and preparing mortification for himself on the exact subject to which he had sacrificed his conscience. Every step that he had taken with a view of gratifying his ambition was retrograde, and while he had been wickedly intent to serve the Marchesa and himself by preventing the marriage of Vivaldi and Elena, he had been laboriously counteracting his own fortune. An alliance with the illustrious house of Vivaldi was above his loftiest hope of advancement, and this event he had himself nearly prevented by the very means which had been adopted at the expense of every virtuous consideration to obtain an inferior promotion. Thus, by a singular retribution, his own crimes had recoiled upon himself. Skidoni perceived the many obstacles which lay between him and his newly awakened hopes, and that much was to be overcome before those nuptials could be publicly solemnised, which he was now still more anxious to promote, that he had lately been to prevent. The approbation of the Marchesa was at least desirable, for she had much at her disposal, and without it, though his daughter might be the wife of Vivaldi, he himself would be no otherwise benefited at present than by the honour of the connection. He had some peculiar reasons for believing that her consent might be obtained, and though there was hazard in delaying the nuptials till such an experiment had been made, he resolved to encounter it, rather than forbear to solicit her concurrence. But if the Marchesa should prove inexorable, he determined to bestow the hand of Elena without her knowledge, and in doing so, he well knew that he incurred little danger from her resentment, since he had secrets in his possession, the consciousness of which must awe her into a speedy neutrality. The consent of the Marchese, as he despaired of obtaining it, he did not mean to solicit, and the influence of the Marchesa was such that Skidoni did not regard that as essential. The first steps, however, to be taken were those that might release Vivaldi from the Inquisition, the tremendous prison into which Skidoni himself, little foreseeing that he should so soon wish for his liberation, had caused him to be thrown. He had always understood, indeed, that if the informer forbore to appear against the accuser in this court, the latter would of course be liberated, and he also believed that Vivaldi's freedom could be obtained whenever he should think proper to apply to a person at Naples whom he knew to be connected with the Holy Office of Rome. How much the confessor had suffered his wishes to deceive him may appear hereafter. His motives for having thus confined Vivaldi were partly those of self-defence. He dreaded the discovery and the vengeance which might follow the loss of Elena, should Vivaldi be at liberty immediately to pursue his inquiries. But he believed that all trace of her must be lost after a few weeks had elapsed, and that Vivaldi's sufferings from confinement in the Inquisition would have given interest to his mind which must weaken the one he felt for Elena. Yet, though in this instance self-defence had been a principal motive with Skidoni, a desire of revenging the insult he had received in the Church of the Spirito Santo, and all the consequent mortifications he experienced, had been a second, and such was the blackness of his hatred and the avarice of his revenge, that he had not considered the suffering which the loss of Elena would occasion Vivaldi as sufficient retaliation. In adopting a mode of punishment so extraordinary as that of imprisonment in the Inquisition, it appears, therefore, that Schedoni was influenced partly by the difficulty of otherwise confining Vivaldi during the period for which confinement was absolutely necessary to the success of his own schemes, and partly by a desire of inflicting the tortures of terror. He had also been encouraged by his discovery of this opportunity for conferring new obligations on the Marchesa. The very conduct that must have appeared to the first glance of an honest mind fatal to his interests, he thought might be rendered beneficial to them, and that his dexterity could so command the business as that the Marchesa should eventually thank him as the deliverer of her son, instead of discovering and execrating him as his accuser; a scheme favoured by the unjust and cruel rule enacted by the tribunal he approached, which permitted anonymous informers. To procure the arrestation of Vivaldi, it had been only necessary to send a written accusation without a name to the Holy Office, with the mention of the place where the accused person might be seized. But the suffering in consequence of this did not always proceed further than the question, since if the informer failed to discover himself to the inquisitors, the prisoner, after many examinations, was released, unless he happened unwarily to incriminate himself. Schedoni, as he did not intend to prosecute, believed therefore that Vivaldi would of course be discharged after a certain period, and supposing it also utterly impossible that he could ever discover his accuser, the confessor determined to appear anxious and active in effecting his release. This character of a deliverer he knew he should be the better enabled to support by means of a person officially connected with the Holy Office, who had already unconsciously assisted his views. In the apartment of this man, Schedoni had accidentally seen a formula of arrestation against a person suspected of heresy, the view of which had not only suggested to him the plan he had since adopted, but had in some degree assisted him to carry it into effect. He had seen the scroll only for a short time, but his observations were so minute and his memory so clear that he was able to copy it with at least sufficient exactness to impose upon the Benedictine priest, who had, perhaps, seldom or never seen a real instrument of this kind. Schedoni had employed this artifice for the purpose of immediately securing Vivaldi, apprehending that, while the inquisitors were slowly deliberating upon his arrest, he might quit Salerno and elude discovery. If the deception succeeded, it would enable him also to seize Elena, and to mislead Vivaldi respecting her destination. The charge of having carried off a nun might appear to be corroborated by many circumstances, and Schedoni would probably have made these the subject of real denunciation, had he not foreseen the danger and the trouble in which it might implicate himself, and that, as the charge could not be substantiated, Elena would finally escape. As far as his plan now went, it had been successful. Some of the bravos whom he hired to impersonate officials had conveyed Vivaldi to the town, where the real officers of the Inquisition were appointed to receive him, while the others carried Elena to the shore of the Adriatic. Schedoni had applauded his own ingenuity in thus contriving, by the matter of the forged accusation, to throw an impenetrable veil over the fate of Elena, and to secure himself from the suspicions or vengeance of Vivaldi, who, it appeared, would always believe that she had died, or was still confined in the unsearchable prisons of the Inquisition. Thus he had betrayed himself in endeavouring to betray Vivaldi, whose release, however, he yet supposed could be easily obtained. But how much his policy had, in this instance, outrun his sagacity now remained to be proved. The subject of Schedoni's immediate perplexity was the difficulty of conveying Helena back to Naples, since, not choosing to appear at present in the character of her father, he could not decorously accompany her thither himself, nor could he prudently entrust her to the conduct of any person whom he knew in this neighbourhood. It was, however, necessary to form a speedy determination, for he could neither endure to pass another day in a scene which must continually impress him with the horrors of the preceding night, nor that Helena should remain in it, and the morning light already gleamed upon his casements. After some further deliberation, he resolved to be himself her conductor, as far at least as through the forests of the Garganus, and at the first town where conveniences could be procured, to throw aside his monk's habit, and, assuming the dress of a layman, accompany her in this disguise towards Naples, till he should discover some secure means of sending her onward to that city, or a temporary asylum for her in a convent on the way. His mind was scarcely more tranquil after having formed this determination than before, and he did not attempt to repose himself even for a moment. The circumstances of the late discovery were almost perpetually recurring to his affrighted conscience, accompanied by a fear that Helena might suspect the real purpose of his midnight visit, and he alternately formed and rejected plausible falsehoods that might assuage her curiosity and delude her apprehension. The hour arrived, however, when it was necessary to prepare for departure, and found him still undecided as to the explanation he should form. Having released Spalatro from his chamber, and given him directions to procure horses and a guide immediately from the neighbouring hamlet, he repaired to Helena's room to prepare her for this hasty removal. On approaching it, a remembrance of the purpose with which he had last passed through these same passages and staircase appealed so powerfully to his feelings that he was unable to proceed, and he turned back to his own apartment to recover some command over himself. A few moments restored to him his usual address, though not his tranquillity, and he again approached the chamber. It was now, however, by way of the corridor. As he unbarred the door, his hand trembled, but when he entered the room, his countenance and manner had resumed their usual solemnity, and his voice only would have betrayed to an attentive observer the agitation of his mind. Helena was considerably affected on seeing him again, and he examined with a jealous eye the emotions he witnessed. The smile with which she met him was tender, but he perceived it pass away from her features, like the aerial colouring that illumines a mountain's brow, and the gloom of doubt and apprehension again overspread them. As he advanced, he held forth his hand for hers, when, suddenly perceiving the dagger he had left in the chamber, he involuntarily withdrew his proffered courtesy, and his countenance changed. Helena, whose eyes followed his to the object that attracted them, pointed to the instrument, took it up, and approached him, saying, "This dagger I found last night in my chamber. Oh, my father!" "That dagger?" said Schedoni with affected surprise. "Examine it," continued Helena, while she held it up. "Do you know to whom it belongs, and who brought it hither?" "What is it you mean?" asked Schedoni, betrayed by his feelings. "Do you know, too, for what purpose it was bought?" said Helena mournfully. The confessor made no reply, but irresolutely attempted to seize the instrument. "Oh, yes, I perceive you know too well," continued Helena. "Here, my father, while I slept—" "Give me the dagger," interrupted Schedoni in a frightful voice. "Yes, my father, I will give it as an offering of my gratitude," replied Helena. But as she raised her eyes, filled with tears, his look and fixed attitude terrified her, and she added with still more persuasive tenderness, "Will you not accept the offering of your child? for having preserved her from the poniard of an assassin?" Schedoni's looks became yet darker. He took the dagger in silence, and threw it with violence to the furthest end of the chamber, while his eyes remained fixed on hers. The force of the action alarmed her. "Yes, it is in vain that you would conceal the truth," she added, weeping unrestrainedly. "Your goodness cannot avail. I know the whole." The last words aroused Schedoni again from his trance. His features became convulsed, and his look furious. "What do you know?" he demanded in a subdued voice that seemed ready to burst in thunder. "All that I owe you," replied Helena. "That last night, while I slept upon this mattress, unsuspicious of what was designed against me, an assassin entered the chamber with that instrument in his hand, and—" A stifled groan from Schedoni checked Helena. She observed his rolling eyes and trembled, till, believing that his agitation was occasioned by indignation against the assassin, she resumed: "Why should you think it necessary to conceal the danger which has threatened me, since it is to you that I owe my deliverance from it? Oh, my father, do not deny me the pleasure of shedding these tears of gratitude. Do not refuse the thanks which are due to you. While I slept upon that couch, while a ruffian stole upon my slumber, it was you, yes. Can I ever forget that it was my father who saved me from his poniard?" Schedoni's passions were changed, but they were not less violent. He could scarcely control them, while he said in a tremulous tone, "It is enough. Say no more." And he raised Helena, but turned away without embracing her. His strong emotion as he paced in silence the furthest end of the apartment excited her surprise, but then she attributed to it a remembrance of the perilous moment from which he had rescued her. Schedoni, meanwhile, to whom her thanks were daggers, was trying to subdue the feelings of remorse that tore his heart, and was so enveloped in a world of his own as to be for some time unconscious of all around him. He continued to stalk in gloomy silence along the chamber, till the voice of Helena, entreating him rather to rejoice that he had been permitted to save her than so deeply to consider dangers which were past, again touched the chord that vibrated to his conscience, and recalled him to a sense of his situation. He then bade her prepare for immediate departure, and abruptly quitted the room, vainly hoping that in flying from the scene of his meditated crime he should leave with it the acuteness of remembrance and the agonizing stings of remorse. He was now more anxious than ever to leave this place. Yet he should still be accompanied by Helena, and her innocent looks, her affectionate thanks, inflicted an anguish which was scarcely endurable. Sometimes, thinking that her hatred, or what to him would be still severer, her contempt, must be more tolerable than this gratitude, he almost resolved to undeceive her respecting his conduct, but as constantly and impatiently repelled the thought with horror, and finally determined to suffer her to account for his late extraordinary visit in the way she had chosen. Spalatro at length returned from the hamlet with horses, but without having procured a guide to conduct the travellers through a tract of the long devolving forests of the Garganus, which it was necessary for them to pass. No person had been willing to undertake so arduous a task, and Spalatro, who was well acquainted with all the labyrinths of the way, now offered his services. End of chapter 21, part 1.